Welcome to this week's episode of Taiwan Tech Update, your weekly roundup of tech news stories from here in Taiwan, presented by me, Tomasz Koper, and Radio Taiwan International. I have a very interesting interview for you on digital sovereignty, possible internet fragmentation, and the war for talent in the age of AI coming up in the second part of the show. So do stick around for that. But first, as usual, we start with the roundup of Taiwan-related tech news for the week of May 9th to May 15th. We start on the weekend, or rather just before, with a Wall Street Journal report on Friday that Apple and Intel had reached a preliminary agreement on chip manufacturing for Apple devices. This reportedly comes after more than a year of intense talks, but the details of the resulting agreement aren't yet known. Regardless, Taiwanese experts were quick to comment that TSMC will remain Apple's biggest supplier despite this new partnership. Liu Peizhen from the Taiwan Institute of Economic Research told the Central News Agency that TSMC's advanced packaging technologies, including INFO or integrated fan-out and CoWoS or chip-on-wafer-on-substrate, are crucial to the performance of Apple's A and M series chips. Intel and Samsung are still lagging behind the Taiwanese chip-making giant in yields and power efficiency, so Apple is unlikely to move the production of its most important products away from TSMC. Liu also said that this will remain the case unless rivals achieve breakthroughs in the 2nm process or gate-all-around technologies. Apple's agreement with Intel is likely the result of tightening production capacities over at TSMC because of high AI demand. On Sunday, the Economy Ministry said that Taiwan-US cooperation is solidifying Taiwan's leadership in AI. They said around 20 Taiwanese companies have proposed investment plans totaling $35 billion, and the government has rolled out 3 major measures to assist businesses in their global expansion, providing corporate financing, establishing Taiwan model industrial parks in the US, and setting up a trade and investment center in Phoenix, Arizona. That's where TSMC's flagship U.S. investment is located. This was followed up on Monday by the news that the National Development Council Chairman Ye Junxian, who is also a director at TSMC, traveled to 3 locations in Arizona to evaluate them as potential locations for industrial parks based on the Taiwan model. Besides Arizona, Houston, Texas is also being considered. Ye said that there are a number of things to look at when picking a location for an industrial park besides just assistance from local governments. Businesses also want to work with local schools and consider housing, education, and healthcare for their workers and their families. But the U.S. is not the only potential destination for Taiwanese investments and industrial parks. The Central News Agency reported on Monday that Poland hopes to establish itself as a gateway for Taiwanese companies entering Europe. That's according to a Business Insider Polska interview with the Polish Deputy Minister of Economic Development and Technology, Michał Jaros. The Taiwan Electrical and Electronic Manufacturers Association, or TIMA, plans to establish the TIMA Science Park in Poland, which would target high-tech industries such as semiconductors and AI servers. TIMA represents around 3,000 companies and accounts for about 1/4 of Taiwan's GDP, so quite the attractive partner for any nation with aspirations of building up its high-tech industry. As Janos pointed out in the interview, this potential investment wouldn't just be a commercial transaction, but rather a strategic initiative supported by governments. He added that the specific location of the investment and the Phase 1 business plan are expected to be officially announced during the Taiwan Expo, scheduled for June 22nd to 24th in Warsaw. Moving away from big business for a second, on Monday, the Education Ministry presented statistics that show Taiwanese university students are increasingly choosing STEM majors over social sciences and humanities. Over 48% of students in the 2025 academic year chose to major in sciences or technology, followed by more than 33% in social sciences and 18% in humanities. Compared to 2020, both social sciences and humanities lost a combined 4.4 percentage points that moved over to STEM. So, a quick personal opinion here. I know that high-tech fields are where the money is these days, and to a young person, it might seem like a safer bet for the future than humanities. But if you're young and thinking about possible career paths, you shouldn't just blindly follow trends, because in 3 or 5 years, depending on your program, the market might look completely different. And who knows, with AI and automation transforming the job market, maybe there will be a greater need for that human touch by the time you graduate. And even if that's not the case, then a group of engineers focused on answering questions like, how can we do this, could always use a humanist asking, should we be doing this? Study what feels interesting to you and contribute to what feels important, because the job market will always find a way to throw a curveball your way, no matter how future-proofed your choice might seem. On Tuesday, we found out that Hungarian, better known as Foxconn, is entering a strategic partnership with the African company Amini and the French state-backed AI and quantum company Bull to build out computing infrastructure in Africa. The goal is to provide access to industrial-grade AI infrastructure to governments, telecom operators, financial institutions, and energy companies. Amini says that Africa's AI and cloud infrastructure is currently concentrated in the hands of a few providers, and that the three-way partnership between Amini, Hungarian, and Bull is a step towards building locally led infrastructure that meets the continent's sovereignty needs. And staying with sovereignty, it was one of the main themes of the 2026 Internet Week event jointly organized by Taiwan's Ministry of Digital Affairs and a number of non-governmental organizations, which kicked off on Tuesday. The event ran until Friday and featured a number of panels and forums focused on internet governance, AI sovereignty, and policy exchanges. Stick around to the second part of the show for an interview with one of the participants. Also on Tuesday, the 2026 Exponential trade show focused on defense and drone technologies opened in Detroit. Over 20 companies were representing Taiwan on the show floor, offering what's increasingly being called the non-red supply chain, so one that doesn't involve Chinese companies. The Ministry of Economic Affairs said this exhibition represents Taiwan's biggest international push into the drone industry since the launch of an overseas business alliance in 2024, which hopes to seek out business opportunities in the US, Japan, and Europe. With geopolitical tensions high and countries like China and Iran dominating the drone industry, especially in its military dimension, those business opportunities are only set to grow in the foreseeable future. On Wednesday, the tech supply chain research company DigiTimes published a report saying that server shipments are expected to exceed 5 million units for the first time in the second quarter of this year. This strong momentum for Taiwanese manufacturers is driven mainly by strong demand from major US-based cloud service providers and brand manufacturers, especially as the market refocuses on agentic AI. This represents a growth of 8.6% compared to the first quarter and 30% compared to the same period last year. On Thursday, TSMC held its Taiwan Technology Symposium in Hsinchu, featuring a few noteworthy and sometimes frankly staggering pieces of information. We learned, for example, that the global semiconductor output is projected to grow to 1.5 trillion US dollars by 2030, driven by AI demand, which will likely replace smartphones as the biggest source of business for chip manufacturers. TSMC also showcased its next-generation chip-making and packaging technologies at the event, which included the A13, A12, and N2U processes, previously previewed in the US. The company also announced what it describes as the largest CoWoS, or chip-on-wafer-on-substrate packaging solution in the world. If you remember from earlier in today's program, this is one of the areas where TSMC is comfortably ahead of the competition, for now at least. TSMC Vice President for Business Development said that the new technology boasts yields of over 98%, with Intel's analog only getting to around 90%, while Samsung has to catch up from somewhere in the 50% range. TSMC also announced the launch of 5 new fabs in 2026 to meet the surging demand for AI and 2-nanometer chips. It projects a growth rate of 70% for 2-nanometer capacity between now and 2028, and an annual growth rate of more than 80% for advanced packaging capacity until the end of 2027. Yeah, I did tell you some of those numbers were staggering. With the growth and accelerating adoption of artificial intelligence, the issue of how we govern it is becoming even more important. So this week, I spoke with Viktor Buzna, a senior research fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Viktor is based in Taiwan and this week participated as a panelist in one of the discussions at the 2026 Internet Week in Taipei. And this is how our conversation went. So, Victor, what is Taiwan doing right, and what is it doing wrong in terms of internet governance?
Oh, well, tough question. In general, if we are talking about Taiwan, and sorry if I may move a bit from internet governance to a bit broader perspective, because in general, in terms of digital governance, cyber governance, the cyberspace, Taiwan is in a very interesting position because Taiwan basically is in a war with the People's Republic of China. There's no armed conflict between the two entities, but they are basically in war, and this war happens in the digital arena and in the cyberspace, and also there's a cognitive warfare which is pretty much related to this. So in these circumstances, given Taiwan, a democratic country, which is still actually being, it can be debated, but it's considered by the literature as a transitional democracy. So it's in a very, very tense situation. How can it build up a regulatory framework? How can it build up its legal framework in order to be able to fight a war against the PRC in the digital arena, and in terms of cognitive warfare to protect its citizens, but still try to defend its democratic values like the freedom of speech. So there is a very interesting game, and that's why Taiwan is being seen as a very important model for other countries in similar situations. For example, Ukraine. Is that it has to balance between these two conflicting interests: the to winning a war against the PRC, or at least to defend its citizens from PRC pressure, and on the other hand, defending its own democratic values from overregulation, and not to mention, of course, the economy, the Taiwanese economy, and the actors in the economy who obviously probably don't want too much regulation and still need to survive.
Well, Taiwanese politicians like to say that Taiwan has a lot to teach the world about battling misinformation and disinformation, as you say, mostly coming from China. Now, is it teaching those lessons effectively, and are others listening to Taiwan's experience?
As far as I know, Taiwan is not very good. I would say the Taiwanese government is not very efficient in teaching these lessons to other countries. There are different reasons for this. First of all, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not probably have the knowledge or lack expertise that could more strategically or more properly use different diplomatic channels in order to better communicate its unique position and its unique capabilities, or to show up as a model in the international arena. On the other hand, and that's very interesting, going back to the question of Taiwan as a democracy and the transitional democracy, Taiwan has a very strong network of NGOs, especially focusing on issues we have just mentioned. For example, digital governance, disinformation and misinformation, cognitive warfare, and so on. Those are actually, I think, quite effective. At least, I'm live in Taiwan, and I'm very much interested in Taiwan's digital governance efforts. So I know about those NGOs. But as far as I see, at least in Europe, these NGOs are there and are active. For example, look at the Internet Week, which is being organized by multiple associations and NGOs and other civic unions. So I think it's very important to mention that there's a need for a more comprehensive government strategy in order to properly communicate the unique position of Taiwan. But on the other hand, Taiwanese NGOs are actually doing a pretty good job in that. Taiwan is not just a model for others, but Taiwan is also very good actually in learning from others. For example, the European Union, the EU, between the EU and Taiwan, I think there's quite good cooperation, and the EU was quite successful in exporting some of its regulatory frameworks, especially the GDPR. But that's also very interesting that Taiwan is always been like super pro EU, and it was very much portraying itself as a good pupil of the European Union. But on the other hand, looking at the PDPA, the Taiwanese privacy regulatory framework, actually it's not a copy of the GDPR. So Taiwan is kind of collecting information, looking at other models around it. Japan, for example, is an important model in many cases for Taiwan, and building up its own regulatory framework and its own policies and strategies. So I kind of like it. I think it's very smart, and I think that's one point that might make Taiwan very successful in this field.
Well, speaking of the Internet Week, digital and AI sovereignty are center stage at the event and in general in discourse these days. Is digital or AI sovereignty truly possible for a country the size of Taiwan?
Yeah, this is there's a controversial here. So on one hand, if a country, let's say Taiwan or anyone else, even the United States, wants to become completely, wants to achieve digital sovereignty completely, then on a certain level, it means the fragmentation of the internet and the digital sphere. So interconnectivity is quite the other side of digital sovereignty, if you know what I mean. So if all the countries and all the actors in the international community are seeking to achieve digital sovereignty, then it means that it's going to harm interoperability. And if it harms interoperability, then it's going to lead to a fragmented internet space, meaning those countries, for example, PRC, which has never been in favor of the so-called multi-stakeholder model, is actually being successful in in communicating, in exporting their own model of internet, which is very much state-centric and which is very much built on data sovereignty.
Well, why is sovereignty important for countries in general? For in Taiwan's case specifically, part of that is probably China and Chinese influence, or a big part of that. But more countries are pushing in that direction. What do they gain from becoming digitally sovereign?
There's a general or a basic shift in terms of how countries, especially in or let's talk about international actors, but maybe how nation states, let's put it this way, how nation states perceive the digital realm and the digital arena. And this sort of shift is very much pointing to the path of techno nationalism in the sense that everyone is now, all these nation states are seeking to maximize their gains in the digital arena, and thinking of the digital field more like as a zero sum game, meaning that if another actor, for example, in case of the United States, if the People Republic of China is becoming more successful or more innovative, or is able to export its technologies and its governance models abroad, then it's harmful for them. And this sort of shift in this whole wide, very broad arena, the digital field, is making the whole environment much more volatile. So, of course, as a response to this phenomena, countries are seeking to become more sovereign in terms of the digital field. But it's of course very difficult because, in general, if most of the Western countries are very much dependent on American technologies. And it was okay for the last couple of decades, but now, American policy is also changing to a different direction. It's becoming more nationalistic, more techno-nationalistic. So it's kind of rings the bell in those governments that, okay, hang on, we have a huge dependency on the United States and American technology, and, maybe one day it's going to harm us. France, for example, Emmanuel Macron, French president, has been a vocal actor of this problem since, I don't know, 2019, 2020. So it's not necessarily related to the Trump administration, but far far before. Actually, during the first Trump administration, especially after the 2017 issue with Huawei. The French government is actually becoming very vocal about the dependency on American technology. So they kind of started to argue that, okay, Europe needs to grow its own indigenous technological ecosystem, and in order to become less dependent on American technology. But here we are, 2026, and Europe is still very much actually dependent on American technology.
Well, speaking of growing your own ecosystem, Taiwan's deputy digital minister, Isabel Ho, said at one of the panels that in talent and training data, Taiwan can only rely on itself but should use foreign technology elsewhere. Would you add anything to that recipe for a healthy dose of AI and maybe more widely digital sovereignty?
When it comes to AI, there's one on one side we have the question and the issue of technology and digital sovereignty and dependence and whatever. There's another very important issue, and that's how can we train and how can we develop, how can we understand what artificial intelligence is, because it's a very rapidly growing emerging technology. And actually, those who understands the work of AI, and those who can actually innovate artificial intelligence, that amount of people is quite low. So here comes the another sphere of this war. What I'm talking about is the war on talents. That's also an ongoing issue in the international arena. There's a increasing scarcity in talents, in those people who engineers, data specialists, and so on, those people who are capable to have the knowledge how to improve and how to develop artificial intelligence and AI related other technologies. So in case of Taiwan, I think that's also a very interesting question. Is Taiwan ready, or is Taiwan willing to invite more talents abroad, and through what programs Taiwan is willing to do this, besides the Golden Visa program and other recent developments? Because other countries, for example, Singapore, is much more successful in this case. So anyway, that's very interesting how Taiwan is positioning itself in the big AI race, and the so-called war on talents is I think it's a very important field.
Thank you very much for this excellent discussion. Viktor Buzna, Senior Research Fellow, Hungarian Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you very much.
And that's all I have for you in this week's edition of Taiwan Tech Update. I'm your host, Tomasz Koper, and I'll be back with another update next week.